Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you. I read the ACSS daily briefing every single day, and it really is a superb compilation. Very well done. I'm also delighted that your suggested reading included this report of the high-level panel on illicit financial flows out of Africa. This report came about as a result of a study that we in GFI did in 2010 on illicit financial flows from Africa. And our study came to the attention of the UN Economic Commission for Africa based in Addis Ababa, and we were asked to come over and make a presentation of our analysis. What was fascinating to the assembled economics team of UNECA is that we were saying that there's something bigger than corruption that's hurting Africa, at least as far as financial flows are concerned, and that is the outflow of commercially derived money. The commercial component of illicit financial flows out of Africa was far bigger than the corrupt component. This was the first time they'd ever heard anybody say that. It grabbed their attention, and UNECA went on to establish the high-level panel to go deeper into this subject matter and asked Thabo Mbeki, the former president of South Africa, to head it. Over the past 3.5 years, we've traveled all over Africa and met lots of heads of state and ministers and central bank governors and customs officials and tax collectors and security people and corporate executives and civil society organizations and so forth. I think it's fair to say that the report that was produced by President Mbeki is a superb piece of work. It was presented to the African Union in January of this year, adopted by the African Union, and indeed President Mbeki is in Addis today and spoke this morning on the issue of illicit financial flows out of Africa. As was said, this session 10 is focusing on accountability and governance, and mainly on corruption in Africa. I want to convey to you 2 points in my remarks this afternoon. One, corruption is part of the larger problem of illicit financial flows. And two, solving the larger problem, which is necessary for solving the particular problem of corruption, is very much a two-way street between Africa, between poorer countries generally, and the richer world. In global financial integrity, we estimate that about $1 trillion a year flows out of developing countries, illegally, illicitly, flows out of developing countries, roughly $1 trillion a year in our latest measure. This has been growing at close to 10% a year, which is considerably faster than the rate of growth of global GDP. So the illicit money is growing faster than our global economies are growing. Out of Africa, we estimate that about 70 billion. The Mbeki report estimates about 50 billion. Our estimate's a little bit higher than that. But we're talking about a phenomenon that's taking around 4.5% of GDP out of Africa every year. We base our estimates, and the UNECA based its estimates on data filed by governments with the International Monetary Fund. And my main point in saying that to you is that means the data is extremely conservative, because there's lots of things that are not included in government data that's filed with the IMF. None of the smuggling component is involved. Some forms of trade misinvoicing are not included. Some forms are, some forms are not. But we think that for Africa, the figure could, if we were able to include those additional components in it, the figure could easily be 100 billion and upwards annually flowing out of Africa. There are three sources of illicit money: corrupt, criminal, and commercial. Corrupt is the bribery and theft by government officials. The criminal is drug trading, human trafficking, and so on. The commercial component is commercially tax evading money that flows out. Globally, we estimate that the corrupt component of cross-border illicit flows is about 5% of the global total. The criminal component is perhaps 30 to 35% of the global total. And the commercially tax evading component is about 60 to 65% of the global total. Now, we have not done a separate analysis of that for Africa alone. So I'm not going to say those percentages hold for Africa. I will say that the ranking holds for Africa. The commercial component's the biggest, criminal next, the corrupt component, remember we're talking about cross-border flows, is the smallest. This flow is facilitated by a global shadow financial system which we in the West built and have cultivated. This system comprises a number of elements. Tax havens. When I first went to Nigeria in 1961, there were only 4 or 5 tax havens around the world. Today, there are more than 60 around the world. We've had an explosion of tax havens. Many of these tax havens function as secrecy jurisdictions. That is to say, you can set up entities behind nominees and trustees such that nobody knows who owns the entities. Disguised corporations are part of this structure. Do you know which country has the most disguised corporations of any? Right here. And that's because in the United States, corporations are established at the state level, and most states permit corporations to be formed by company formation agents. And in most states, it is not the responsibility of the company formation agent to file with the state who owns the business. So we've got literally millions of entities in the United States that even law enforcement cannot penetrate to figure out who's the real owner, who's the beneficial owner of those entities. Anonymous trust accounts are part of this. Fake foundations, all sorts of false documentation is used. Falsified pricing in imports and exports is the most frequently used component of this structure. And then there are loopholes left in the laws of our Western countries, United States and others, that facilitate the flow of this money out of Africa and other parts of the developing world, ultimately into our Western economies. You may be familiar with HSBC and Wachovia, both having been found with enormous amounts of money from drug dealers and others. And of course, they threw up their hands and said, our anti-money laundering policies didn't work well enough. Well, that's not really the case. There's a lot more to it than that. All three sources of illicit money, the corrupt, the criminal, and commercial, use this system to shift across borders, use exactly the same system to shift across borders. The key fallacy in our global anti-money laundering efforts is the idea that we can continue to hold on to the use of this structure to move tax evading money, while at the same time making others give up their use of the structure to move corrupt and criminal money. This is not possible. It cannot be done. As long as we use this structure to move the commercial component, it will be available to move the criminal and the corrupt components. Solving this problem, I repeat, is a two-way street between rich and poorer countries. Okay, how do you solve it? The short answer is financial transparency. Greater transparency in the global financial system, in the systems of richer countries and in the systems of developing countries. Okay, what does this mean? That's grand terminology, financial transparency. What does this mean? Let's first of all get rid of those disguised corporations. It is ridiculous that we do business with entities that we don't know who owns them. That's just not acceptable, and yet it is the case. The first thing we have to do is get rid of the disguised entities. Second thing that is in process now is automatic exchange of tax information. As I'm sure many of you know, we've had that kind of arrangement with Canada for decades. We recently decided to do the same thing with Mexico. And now the FACTA legislation, which has been put in place by the United States, requires all foreign financial institutions to report to the United States earnings by American citizens on bank accounts in foreign countries. And of course, the foreign countries are insisting on reciprocal arrangements too. So this automatic exchange of tax information is progressing, and that's a very good component of this. In global financial integrity, we also promote a third, what we think is vitally important element of transparency that we call country-by-country reporting. That is to say, all multinational corporations should report what they're doing in every place where they're in business. Sales, profits, taxes paid, employment figures, and so on. This is not the case at the present time. But we advocate that is necessary. The reality is that many multinational corporations operate in developing countries at a loss or at a break-even point or at very, very minimal profits. How do you lose money or break even where you're in business and yet make huge amounts of money in tax havens where you're not in business? How do you do that? How do you lose money where you're in business and make money where you're not in business? You do it with trade pricing. You do it with abusive transfer pricing of the price of imports and exports that are coming in and out of the country. It's very simple to do. It's done all the time. I don't know of an American company that has not used abusive transfer pricing on some aspect of its business in the developing world. Okay, let me come down from the 30,000-foot altitude a little bit and roam around the continent and talk about some specifics that are going on in various countries. And here I'll draw on my travels, and I'll also draw on some of the economic intelligence work that GFI has done for governments. Let's take bunkering in the Niger Delta, the theft of oil in the Niger Delta. We did a study of this for the government of Nigeria. We used a triangulation exercise in order to come up with the best possible estimate of how much is being stolen out of the pipelines in the Niger Delta. First part of that was satellite imagery. We and Digital Globe analyzed millions of satellite images and were able to give to the Nigerian government the latitude and longitude location of every point in the Niger Delta where oil was being stolen or where it was being loaded onto barges and taken through the creeks and offshore. The second part of that triangulation exercise was interviewing the bunkerers themselves, the thieves themselves. We interviewed 60 of them, and it's amazing how consistent the data was that we got from all of them. They were perfectly willing to talk about what they were doing because they regarded it as their oil. It doesn't belong to the government of Nigeria, it belongs to us who live here. And so they told us exactly what they were doing, and the data checked out extremely well. The third element of that was interviewing industry executives. They were a good bit more reticent to talk about this because they know there's a lot of corruption mixed up in this. But they provided some decent data. With that triangulation process, we were able to produce an estimate of $6 to $12 billion a year of oil being stolen straight out of the pipelines in the Niger Delta. Zambia. I have railed at the highest levels of the Zambian government that they have no measure of how much copper is going out of Zambia. They are entirely dependent on what's reported to them by the mining companies. But I shouldn't single out Zambia because in our high-level panel report, it was confirmed for every commodity exported out of Africa from every country, the government had no measure. It was dependent on what was told to them by the corporations as to what was going out. Illegal logging, Liberia. Helen Johnson Sirleaf, the president, would like you to believe that she's got a handle on this. She tags every log that goes out. Not so. A lot of illegal logging is still going out of Liberia without being properly counted. The Arab Spring. When it sprung, we all thought that there would be a return of money to Libya and Tunisia and to Egypt. That hasn't happened. Money was frozen in Switzerland and elsewhere, but there's been very little return. The only thing that has been returned has come back to Tunisia as a result of the governor of the central bank, Chedi Ayari, telephoning the governor of the central bank in Lebanon and saying, I understand that Ben Ali's sister has $26 or $27 million in, how much? $28 million in a Lebanese bank account. Can you return that? And the governor of the central bank of Lebanon, they went through the legal niceties to make it look proper, but the money was returned to Tunisia. That's the only money that has come back since the Arab Spring began. Angola, 25 years ago, I met an Angolan general who is nicknamed Copalipa. And I didn't know at the time, but I found out shortly afterwards that he is the bagman for the Dos Santos family. He's the one that handles their skullduggery. So what he's been doing of late is taking Angolan assets to buy media assets in Portugal. My understanding is it encompasses television, radio, and press. This is really an interesting situation because it is the colonized now buying the colonizer. It's reversing that process. Equatorial Guinea, you perhaps know of the Obiang family that runs the country. We in the United States seized some $30 million worth of property in California that Obiang held, but that didn't disturb him very much because all he has to do is to steal the same amount again somewhere else. Egypt, as some of you know, the military is heavily in business in Egypt. We don't know to what percent of the economy they control, probably 20 or 25%, something like that. And another thing we don't know is how much money they have out of Egypt and where that money is. Egypt's a very interesting situation. Back to Nigeria, Boko Haram. We and perhaps some of your organizations had imagery on Boko Haram's encampments in northeastern Nigeria. And neither we nor anybody else felt comfortable releasing that imagery because Boko Haram would then move the girls that had been kidnapped and were being held in that forest. So we were really quite conflicted over having that kind of information, but not being comfortable releasing it. Okay, perhaps you think that you don't solve this kind of problem with some sort of grand financial transparency approach. You solve it with a case-by-case law enforcement approach. I don't agree with that. And my favorite example of that is the Drug Enforcement Administration. There may be somebody here from the DEA. I'm not calling you out. I have great respect for the courage the DEA brings to its activities. But I think the efforts of the DEA are misdirected. DEA has been in business for 40 years, and across those 40 years has not succeeded in curtailing the supply of drugs or raising the price of drugs. This is the definition of failure. And that failure stems from the fact that DEA has been taking a law enforcement approach applied to the product. And they should have been taking a systemic approach applied to the money. DEA goes after caches of drugs and tunnels and individual drug dealers and so forth. But this has not been working. The UN Office of Drugs and Crimes in Vienna estimates that globally we succeed in interdicting about 40% of hard drugs somewhere between point of production and point of consumption. 40%. We succeed in interdicting or getting our hands on less than 1/2 of 1% of the money. That's not the way you go about succeeding in this business. DEA should be, in our judgment, taking a systemic approach applied to the money, not a law enforcement approach applied to the product. DEA has a small anti-money laundering effort, but it's not adequately supported by other parts of the government. I ask the question sometimes, how do you curtail the supply of something that is in endless supply? Drugs are in endless supply. How do you curtail that? Not by going after the drugs, not by going after the product. Now, the point that I'm making applies equally to corruption, which is the main topic of what we're talking about. How do you curtail the supply of corruption, which is in endless supply? You can't do it by going after the individual corrupt officials. I've heard many people say, no, we made an example of Obiang in Equatorial Guinea when we seized his assets. I said to you a moment ago, Obiang just went out and stole the same amount again. His family runs, it's his family enterprise. So we didn't make an example by seizing Obiang's assets. The same thing will be done again until we figure out that we need to take a systemic approach to this problem. I emphasize this because I've seen too much failure around the world in attempting to curtail corruption, curtail crime, and so forth by taking a very narrow focused approach on a particular example of that. It's not working. We're dealing with a systemic problem. It will work when we decide to take a systemic approach to the problem. Thank you.